The pig's entrance was magnificently timed. Just as Patricia was escorting the mayor's wife to her VIP seat in the front row, Barney crested the small rise at the back of the meadow. Behind him, like a porcine wedding procession of their own, came 9 other heritage pigs, their coats freshly mud-splattered and glistening in the afternoon sun. The string quartet was the first to notice, the violinist's bow screeching to a halt mid-Mozart. Then came a gasp from the flower girl, followed by the increasingly loud murmurs of 200 guests turning to stare at the approaching drove. Morgane. Patricia's scream cut through the confused chatter. She stood frozen in the center aisle, her lavender mother of the bride dress a perfect complement to the purple rage suffusing her face. Morgan emerged from her barn, clipboard in hand. "Yes, Patricia. Get these animals out of here immediately." Morgan consulted her clipboard with exaggerated thoroughness. "According to my rotation schedule, the Eastern Meadow is their designated grazing area today. Has been for years." "This is sabotage," Patricia hissed, as Barney ambled closer, drawn by the scent of the charcuterie board. "This is farming," Morgan corrected. "I'm simply continuing my normal operations, as I informed the sheriff I would be doing." Guests were now standing on chairs as the pigs moved cheerfully among them. Barney had discovered the cake table and was eyeing the 5-tier masterpiece with unmistakable interest. 2 smaller pigs had wandered into the tent, where the band was hurriedly elevating their instruments. The wedding planner was in full crisis mode, gesticulating wildly into her headset while simultaneously trying to shoo pigs away with the centerpiece. The caterers had formed a defensive perimeter around their stations, armed with serving trays held like shields. Amid the chaos, a sleek black Tesla pulled up, and the groom emerged, looking confused. He was followed moments later by a vintage Rolls-Royce delivering Caroline, who stepped out and surveyed the scene with widening eyes. Morgan braced herself for another screeching confrontation, but what happened next surprised everyone, especially Patricia. Caroline burst into laughter, not polite titters, but deep, genuine belly laughs that caused her to brace herself against the car. The groom joined her, doubled over as Barney successfully claimed a lower tier of the wedding cake. "Mom," Caroline gasped between fits of laughter, "what did you do?" Patricia sputtered incoherently about sabotage and lawsuits as Caroline made her way to Morgan's side, careful to navigate around a particularly content pig who was rolling luxuriously on the white runner. "You must be the actual owner," Caroline said, still fighting back giggles. "I'm Caroline. This was supposed to be my wedding. Morgan Jenkins. And technically, it still can be your wedding, just with some uninvited guests." The groom joined them, extending his hand. "I'm David. I'm a veterinarian. Actually," he glanced appreciatively at the pigs. "Beautiful Berkshires. Heritage breed." Before Morgan could answer, Patricia swooped in, practically vibrating with fury. "We are leaving. Caroline, get in the car. Everyone." She turned to the bewildered guests. "The venue has been changed to the country club. Please proceed there immediately." "Mom, stop." Caroline's voice was quiet but firm. "You planned a wedding on someone else's property without permission. Did you really think that would work? I did it for you." "No, you did it for your Instagram, just like everything else." A tense silence fell over the assembled crowd. Even the pigs seemed to sense the drama, pausing in their exploration of upturned chairs and scattered programs. Morgan Jenkins was knee-deep in compost when she heard the unmistakable crunch of tires on her gravel driveway. She'd been tending to her small family farm for nearly a decade, 15 acres of rebellion against the suburban sprawl that had gradually surrounded her land like rising floodwaters. The latest encroachment was Meadow Vista Estates, a cookie-cutter subdivision whose name was as ironic as its proximity to her property was annoying. Wiping soil-covered hands on her overalls, Morgan rounded the corner of her barn to find not 1 but 3 vehicles parked on her property. A gleaming white Range Rover, a catering van emblazoned with elegant occasions, and a florist's truck overflowing with white roses and baby's breath. In the center of it all stood a woman with aggressively highlighted blonde hair cut in a sharp bob, designer sunglasses perched on her nose to spite the cloudy day. She was gesturing across Morgan's eastern meadow, the same meadow where her prized heritage pigs were scheduled to graze tomorrow, while speaking loudly into a Bluetooth earpiece. The altar will go right there, framed by those trees. We'll need to clear some of these weeds, of course. The woman's French manicured finger pointed directly at Morgan's award-winning heirloom tomato plants. "Excuse me," Morgan called out, stalking toward the group. "What exactly do you think you're doing on my property?" The woman turned, giving Morgan a quick up-and-down assessment that ended with a dismissive smile. "You must be the caretaker. Perfect timing. I need someone to move those ugly animal pens. They'll ruin the photos." Morgan crossed her arms. "I'm Morgan Jenkins, the owner, and those ugly animal pens house my championship Berkshire pigs." The woman's smile didn't waver as she extended her hand. "Patricia Winters, HOA president of Meadow Vista Estates. I'm planning my daughter Caroline's wedding. This meadow is exactly what she's dreamed of, that rustic farm aesthetic that's so popular on Pinterest. Well, I'm sorry, but this rustic farm isn't available for weddings, especially not without asking the owner first." Patricia laughed as if Morgan had told a charming joke. "Oh, that's all been arranged through the county. Our subdivision's covenant actually extends 50 feet past the property line due to the original agricultural easement." Morgan's jaw dropped. "That's absolutely false. I've owned this land free and clear for 10 years. Patricia sighed dramatically and lowered her voice. "Look, the invitations have gone out to 200 guests, including the mayor and 3 state representatives. The wedding is in 11 days. You can either cooperate and make a tidy sum, or—" she glanced meaningfully toward the sprawling houses of Meadow Vista Estates, "or we can revisit those noise complaints about your roosters, and those permit questions about your farm stand." Before Morgan could respond, Patricia pressed a business card into her hand. "The rental company will be here Tuesday to start setup. My daughter's getting the authentic farm experience she wants. And if you're smart, you'll take the check and stay out of our way." With that, she swept back to her Range Rover, leaving Morgan standing in her own driveway, speechless with rage. What Patricia didn't notice was the calculating look that replaced Morgan's initial shock, or the family of mud-loving pigs grunting contentedly just beyond the barn. Morgan crumpled the business card in her fist and marched back to her farmhouse, the screen door slamming behind her with satisfying force. Her hands trembled as she poured herself a glass of homemade blackberry wine, a remedy her grandmother had sworn by for dealing with difficult people. "The absolute nerve," she muttered to herself, pacing the worn floorboards of her kitchen. Through the window, she could still see Patricia's Range Rover idling at the end of the driveway, while the woman herself took photos of the meadow with her phone, presumably documenting the perfect wedding venue she'd secured. Morgan's farmhouse told the story of 4 generations of Jenkins farmers who had worked this land. Photos of her great-grandfather's first harvest hung beside her own agricultural awards. The deed to the property, the very same one that proved Patricia's claims were nonsense, was framed prominently in the hallway. Her phone buzzed with a text from her neighbor, Sam. "Why is there a florist's van by your meadow? New side business I don't know about." "So, how'd it go with the HOA Nazis?" he asked without preamble. "About as well as you'd expect," Morgan sighed. "Patricia basically admitted she's commandeering my land and threatened to sick her husband's zoning board on me if I don't play along." "Roger Winters," Sam growled. "That explains it. Man's been trying to rezone half the county for his developer buddies." Morgan pressed her fingers to her temples. "I need to fight this, but I can't afford a lengthy legal battle or to have my farm operations suspended while they investigate some trumped-up violations." There was a pause on the line before Sam said slowly, "You know, my sister-in-law works for the county clerk, says Roger's been playing fast and loose with permits for years. Word is the state ethics board has an open file on him." Morgan straightened. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that people who live in glass subdivisions shouldn't throw stones," Sam finished. "Give me a day to make some calls." After hanging up, Morgan walked back to the barn. The evening was settling over the farm, painting the meadow, her meadow, in soft golds and purples. the very same meadow where Patricia planned to host 200 guests in designer clothes and uncomfortable shoes. Her pigs were settling in for the night, Barney positioning himself protectively near the younger members of the drove. These weren't just livestock to Morgan, they were partners in her sustainable farming operation. More than that, they were intelligent beings with personalities as distinct as any pet dog. Would the wedding guests appreciate that? Would they understand that this wasn't some quaint backdrop for their Instagram photos, but a working farm where real food was grown and real animals lived? Morgan doubted it. She leaned against the fence, watching as the pigs arranged their sleeping quarters with surprising fastidiousness. Something Patricia had said kept replaying in her mind. My daughter's getting the authentic farm experience she wants. An authentic farm experience. Now there was a thought. Morgan pulled out her phone and began researching local ordinances regarding livestock containment. As a farm predating the surrounding development, she operated under grandfather clauses that gave her certain exemptions. Exemptions that Patricia and her zoning board husband couldn't easily override. She found what she was looking for in Section 12.3 of the County Code. Agricultural operations established prior to residential development retain reasonable use rights to their property, including, but not limited to crop production, animal husbandry, and rotational grazing practices. Rotational grazing practices. Morgan smiled to herself as she pictured Patricia's face if that rotation happened to coincide with her perfectly planned wedding. She closed the county website and opened her calendar app, where she maintained her livestock rotation schedule. With a few taps, she rearranged the coming week's plan. The Eastern Meadow, Wedding Ground Zero, would now be scheduled for pig grazing on Saturday. Not illegal, not confrontational, just farming as usual, Morgan murmured to herself, pocketing her phone and heading back to the house. She had preparations to make. Then David cleared his throat. Actually, I kind of like it here. He turned to Morgan. Would it be completely crazy to still have the ceremony? With your permission, of course. And he grinned at Barney, who had icing on his snout. With your pigs as additional guests of honor? Morgan blinked in surprise. You want to get married in a meadow full of pigs? Caroline looked at David, then back at Morgan. It would make a better story than anything my mother planned. And so, as the sun began its golden descent, Caroline and David were married in Morgan's meadow. The ceremony was relocated to the barn, which the groomsmen quickly decorated with flowers salvaged from the meadow. The pigs were cordoned off as VIP guests in a special section, where children from the wedding party took turns feeding them approved treats under Morgan's supervision. Patricia left in a fury, along with a handful of her closest friends. But surprisingly, most of the guests stayed, enchanted by the authenticity of the improvised celebration. The mayor's wife declared it the most memorable wedding she'd ever attended, and the photographer captured priceless shots of the bride and groom with Barney and his friends. As the party wound down under the stars, Caroline and David sought out Morgan, who was stacking the last of the rented chairs. I can't thank you enough, Caroline said. Not just for letting us stay, but for showing me it's okay to stand up to my mother. Your pigs are invited to our anniversary party next year, David added with a grin, though perhaps with slightly more advance notice. The next morning's local newspaper featured a front-page story. HOA president's power play backfires. Pigs saved the day at unauthorized farm wedding. The accompanying photo showed Caroline and David beaming beside Barney, who sported a jaunty bow tie fashioned from a napkin. The article, meticulously researched by Tyler, detailed Patricia's history of using her husband's position to intimidate neighbors, leading to an ethics investigation at the county level. As for Morgan, she found her farm stand suddenly overrun with customers eager to meet the wedding pigs. She began offering educational tours, teaching visitors about sustainable farming practices and the importance of local agriculture. And Barney, he received fan mail, including a thank you card from Caroline and David and a formal certificate from the Meadow Vista Estates' newly elected HOA board under fresh leadership, declaring him an honorary defender of property rights. Some months later, when Patricia put her house up for sale and moved to another county, the for sale sign mysteriously disappeared from her front yard. It was eventually discovered in Barney's pen, serving as a surprisingly effective back scratcher for the pig who had crashed a wedding and changed the community. True to Patricia's word, Tuesday brought an invasion of rental trucks and workers to Morgan's farm. She watched from her kitchen window as they unloaded white folding chairs, erected a massive tent, and began constructing an elaborate floral arch in her meadow, all while carefully avoiding eye contact with her. Morgan had spent the previous evening making calls of her own. One to her lawyer, who confirmed she was well within her rights to refuse the wedding, but cautioned against confrontation that might lead to property damage claims. One to the sheriff, explaining the situation and establishing that she wasn't denying access, but wouldn't be restricting her normal farm operations. And finally, one to her oldest friend Tyler, who happened to be a reporter for the local newspaper. "You're saying this HOA woman is forcing a wedding on your property?" Tyler had asked incredulously. "And threatening me with her husband's zoning board connections if I object," Morgan confirmed. "That's actually a pretty juicy story about abuse of power," Tyler mused. "Mind if I start asking some questions around town?" As the wedding infrastructure grew, Morgan focused on her own preparations. She adjusted feeding schedules, rearranged the grazing rotation, and spent extra time with her 10 Hampshire Berkshire pigs, particularly Barney, the 300-pound patriarch of her drove, who had a particular talent for detecting food at remarkable distances. On Wednesday, Patricia arrived with her daughter Caroline and a photographer. Morgan watched from behind her barn as the young woman posed in various spots around the meadow, looking every bit the Pinterest-perfect bride in her flowing white dress. Unlike her mother, Caroline seemed uncomfortable, her smile fixed, and her eyes darting nervously toward the farmhouse. Morgan stepped into view, and Patricia immediately moved to intercept her. "We're just taking a few pre-wedding photos," Patricia said, her voice honeyed, but her eyes cold. "I've left several messages about your compensation." "Actually, you haven't," Morgan replied calmly. "But that's not why I'm here. I wanted to speak with Caroline directly." The bride approached cautiously. Up close, she looked exhausted, purple shadows beneath eyes that held none of her mother's entitlement. "I understand this is your wedding," Morgan said gently. Caroline nodded, twisting her engagement ring. "I'm sorry about all this. I thought Mom had arranged everything properly. Did you want a farm wedding?" Caroline glanced at her mother, then back to Morgan. "I wanted a small ceremony at the botanical gardens, actually." "This is all." She gestured vaguely at the elaborate setup. "This is Mom's vision." Before Morgan could respond, Patricia inserted herself between them. "That's enough chit-chat. Caroline," the photographer wants shots by the old oak tree." As they walked away, Morgan noticed Caroline look back, mouthing what appeared to be, "I'm sorry." By Saturday morning, wedding day, Morgan's farm had been transformed. White chairs lined a makeshift aisle leading to a flower-bedecked altar. Catering tables groaned under elegant appetizers. String lights hung from trees, and a dance floor gleamed in the center of the tent. Morgan observed it all while feeding her pigs an especially aromatic breakfast of overripe fruit and vegetable scraps. Barney watched the activity in the meadow with unusual interest, his snout twitching at the distant scent of canapés. At precisely 3:30 p.m., as guests began arriving in their finery and the string quartet tuned their instruments, Morgan opened the gate to the pig enclosure and casually walked away, leaving it invitingly ajar. The day had been building to this moment since dawn. Morgan had risen early, the familiar chorus of roosters her alarm clock. She'd watched from her porch, coffee mug in hand, as an army of vendors descended on her property. Florists arranging elaborate centerpieces, audiovisual technicians running cables across her carefully maintained soil, caterers setting up a towering display of champagne glasses. Most galling of all was the wedding planner, a rail-thin woman with a clipboard and an earpiece who had the audacity to ask Morgan to please keep your farm activities quiet during the ceremony. Morgan had smiled and nodded, making absolutely no promises. Around noon, Sam arrived with his truck. "Brought you reinforcements," he called, lowering the tailgate to reveal several bales of fresh straw. Figured your VIP guests might need special accommodations. Morgan laughed. The first genuine laugh she'd had in days. You're a good friend, Sam. Morgan typed back furiously. Whole president thinks she's commandeering my farm for her daughter's wedding. Without asking. Sam's reply was immediate. No way. Need backup? Before Morgan could respond, she heard excited oinking from outside. Barney, her prize boar, with an uncanny ability to escape any enclosure, had found his way to the hedge separating the barnyard from the driveway. He was watching Patricia with unusual interest, his intelligent eyes following her every move as she strutted around Morgan's property like she owned it. Not yet, Morgan texted back to Sam. But I might need your trailer on wedding day. How do you feel about transporting some special guests? She set down her phone and walked outside toward Barney, who greeted her with an enthusiastic grunt. Morgan scratched behind his ears, his favorite spot. What do you think, Barney? Should we show Patricia what a real farm experience is like? The pig snorted and tossed his head, almost as if nodding in agreement. Morgan couldn't help but smile. In all her years of farming, she'd learned one fundamental truth. Nature had a way of humbling even the most entitled people. As Patricia's Range Rover finally pulled away, dust billowing behind it, Morgan pulled out her laptop. First, she'd research exactly what rights she had as a property owner. Then, she'd make a call to her cousin, who worked for the county clerk's office, to verify that no permits had been filed for an event on her land. And finally, she'd start planning exactly what her pig schedule would be 11 days from now. Coincidentally, right around the time 200 wedding guests would be arriving in their formal wear. Morgan took another sip of blackberry wine and smiled. If Patricia Winters wanted an authentic farm wedding, Morgan Jenkins was more than happy to oblige. By Monday morning, Morgan had left 14 increasingly assertive voicemails on Patricia's phone and received nothing but automated responses from the Meadow Vista Estates HOA email. Armed with her property deed, survey maps, and a simmering sense of injustice, she drove to the community center where the HOA board was holding its monthly meeting. The Mediterranean-inspired building was a monument to suburban excess, with a fountain featuring a concrete cherub that bore an unfortunate resemblance to Patricia herself. Morgan ignored the receptionist's protests and pushed through the double doors into a room where 5 board members sat around a mahogany table. Ms. Jenkins, Patricia said coolly, not bothering to stand. We're in the middle of discussing the seasonal flower rotation for the entrance display. I don't care if you're discussing the second coming, Morgan replied, dropping her folder onto the table with a satisfying thwack. You've scheduled a wedding on my property without my consent, which is not just audacious, it's illegal. The other board members shifted uncomfortably as Morgan laid out her case, complete with property boundary documentation and screenshots of the county GIS system, clearly showing her land boundaries. Your so-called agricultural easement doesn't exist, Morgan concluded, and neither does your right to host 200 people on my farm. A balding man at the end of the table cleared his throat. Patricia, is this true? The wedding venue isn't approved. Patricia's smile remained fixed, but her knuckles whitened around her designer pen. Morgan is exaggerating the situation. We've used that meadow for community photos for years. You absolutely have not, Morgan countered. Furthermore, Patricia continued as if Morgan hadn't spoken, my daughter Caroline has her heart set on this venue. The deposit is non-refundable, and a cancellation would devastate her. A woman with a kind face spoke up. Perhaps we could offer compensation that would make it worth Ms. Jenkins' while. Morgan leaned forward. This isn't about money. It's about respect and basic decency, concepts that seem foreign to your president here. Patricia's facade finally cracked. How dare you? My husband chairs the county zoning board. One phone call from him about your commercial farming activities in a residentially adjacent property could shut you down for months. The meeting disintegrated from there, with Patricia making increasingly transparent threats about health inspections, noise ordinances, and unfortunate accidents involving property tax reassessments. The other board members looked mortified but remained silent. Morgan left feeling no closer to resolution, but with the sinking realization that Patricia's connections might actually cause her significant problems if she fought this too publicly. That night, as she fed her pigs their evening meal, Morgan noticed her favorite sow Penelope watching her with unusual attentiveness. "What would you do, Penny?" Morgan asked, scratching behind the pig's ears. Penelope responded by rolling joyfully in a particularly fragrant patch of mud, emerging covered in dark splatters that would have horrified Patricia's pristine sensibilities. Morgan stared at the mud-covered pig for a long moment before a slow, mischievous smile spread across her face. "You know what, Penny? I think you just might be onto something." Back at her kitchen table, Morgan spread out the county zoning map she'd printed. Her farm was indeed zoned agricultural, a designation her family had fought to maintain through 3 generations of encroaching development. Patricia's threats weren't entirely hollow. Her husband, Roger Winters, did chair the zoning board, and he had a reputation for making life difficult for anyone who crossed him. Morgan's phone rang. It was Sam. They finished setting up what Morgan privately called Operation Authentic Farm Experience. Comfortable bedding for the pigs, strategically placed feed troughs, and a newly cleared path that led directly from the enclosure to the wedding area. As a piece de resistance, Sam helped Morgan position an old mud wallow perfectly between the catering tables and the dance floor. "You've thought of everything," Sam chuckled, admiring their work. "Let's call it a learning opportunity for our suburban friends," Morgan replied. As Sam drove away, he called back through the window. "Tyler says he'll be here for the tail end, bringing a photographer too." The afternoon progressed with military precision. Patricia arrived at 2 p.m., inspecting every detail with hawk-like intensity. She seemed to have forgotten Morgan existed, which suited Morgan just fine. The mother of the bride was resplendent in a lavender dress that probably cost more than Morgan's monthly fee bill, her hair sprayed into rigid perfection. At 2:45 p.m., Morgan retreated to her barn to implement the final phase of her plan. Her pigs, clean by pig standards, but still unmistakably farm animals, watched her with interest as she mixed their pre-wedding meal, a fragrant combination of overripe melons, slightly fermented apple mash, and their favorite treats. Nothing that would harm them, but guaranteed to produce the most authentic farm aromas possible. "Dinner will be served soon, my friends," Morgan told them, scratching Barney's ears. "But you'll need to work up an appetite first, perhaps a little stroll." Barney snorted in what Morgan chose to interpret as enthusiastic agreement. By 3:15 p.m., the meadow was filling with guests. From her vantage point by the barn, Morgan could see women in impractical heels sinking into the soft earth, men in expensive suits already sweating in the afternoon sun, and children in formal wear looking miserable and constrained. This was no place for a wedding. It was a place for growing food, for raising animals, for living in harmony with the land, not for Patricia's social media spectacle. Morgan checked her watch. 3:28 p.m. Perfect timing. She could hear the string quartet beginning the pre-ceremony music, the familiar strains of Pachelbel's canon drifting across the meadow, the scent of catering wafted on the breeze, an irresistible beacon for her porcine cleanup crew. At exactly 3:30 p.m., Morgan opened the gate and stepped back. She didn't need to encourage the pigs. They knew exactly where the interesting smells were coming from. Barney led the charge, his substantial bulk moving with surprising grace toward the promise of forbidden delicacies. As she watched her pigs trot happily toward the wedding, Morgan felt a strange sense of justice. She wasn't destroying anything. She wasn't being confrontational. She was simply allowing nature, farm nature, to take its course. And if Patricia Winters wanted an authentic farm experience, Morgan Jenkins was more than happy to provide one, with all the mud, snorts, and barnyard reality that entailed.